How stands the glass around? For shame ye take no care, me boys. How stands the glass around? Let mirth and wine abound. The trumpets sound, the colours they are flying, boys, to fight, kill or wound. May we still be found, content with our heart fair, me boys, on the cold, cold ground.
Hello, I'm John Knight, author of War at Saber Point, Banastre Tarleton and the British Legion. In this short video essay I aim to provide some background on Tarleton and the Americans he led and share my thoughts on why he suffered his one disastrous defeat, the Battle of Cowpens. This assessment will be solely from the British viewpoint, as there are many scholarly articles on this site that discuss the battle from the American perspective. Bloody Ban Tarleton is the Englishman Americans love to hate, and his reputation as a vicious war criminal, burner of churches with or without their occupants, and a morally repugnant psychopath continues to this day. But is this the fair portrayal of the man, or does Tarleton's reputation suffer from one inconvenient truth? Could it be that he is reviled not for being a terrible soldier, but rather for being an excellent one? My aim with War at Saber Point was not to convert people, but rather to present an accurate set of facts from which they could draw their own conclusions, to contrast Tarleton's heinous reputation with verifiable evidence, much of which contradicts the notion that the British commander was a cold-blooded killer. Banastre Tarleton, the second son of John and Jane Tarleton, was born in August 1754 in the northern port of Liverpool. His father had made a fortune from West Indies sugar and West African slaves, and by his death in 1773 had transformed the Tarletons into one of the northern England's most influential and prosperous merchant families. As Mayor of Liverpool, John Tarleton was known as the Great T, and he had similarly high expectations of his son Banastre, educated him well by sending him to Oxford and then the Middle Temple to study law. But Tarleton failed to complete either discipline, dropping out of Oxford and failing to complete his law exams. Instead, armed with his father's bequest of £5,000 or $1 million in today's money, Tarleton was enticed to the honeypot of St James in London, where alongside other dissolute macaronis and libertines he squandered his entire fortune within 18 months. Gaming and womanizing were Tarleton's vices of choice, and it was in London that the destructive personality trait first surfaced. The man was a gambler with a low boredom threshold, frustrated by routine and always looking for the next adrenaline rush, whether at the Faro table or the bedside. This attitude would manifest itself in his approach to combat, with disastrous results at Cowpens. The army appears to have been Tarleton's last chance to redeem himself, and he purchased his commission, or rather his mother purchased it for him, for he was insolvent, in April 1775, a day after hostility between Britain and America erupted into bloodshed at Lexington. Though his regiment, the King's Own, was stationed in England, Tarleton was an ambitious young man in a hurry, and immediately volunteered for overseas service. He arrived in America as part of the fleet under Sir Henry Clinton that failed to conquer Charleston, and was assigned to the reserve under Charles Cornwallis during the battles for New York, and took no part in the fighting. Tarleton's modest military career may have ended at this point, but throughout his life Ban had a valuable gift. He knew how to make influential friends, and in America Sir William Harcourt became the first of several aristocrats to advance his career. Under Harcourt, Tarleton was one of a handful of soldiers selected from the 16th Dragoons to capture General Charles Lee from Widow White's near Basking Ridge. In a special forces operation lasting only 15 minutes, the British captured one of the most capable officers in the Continental Army for the loss of a single horse. Tarleton's quick thinking and courage was fundamental to the coup, and his success marked him out as an officer of initiative and ability. The young dragoon had been recognised, and soon after he was promoted to Major of Brigade of the 2 regiments of British cavalry in America. Tarleton remained active with the 16th Dragoons during the battles of Brandywine and the occupation of Philadelphia, where in May 1778 he attended the Mecanzienza festival organised by John Andre. As one of the fabled knights, Tarleton was given the opportunity to personalise his shield, and it's significant that he chose the motto, "Swift, vigilant and bold," a maxim that could be described as a default tactic once commander of the British Legion. After the defeat at Saratoga and the declaration of war on France, the British government ordered the evacuation of Philadelphia and withdrew 9,000 men and 25 warships from the American theatre. This decision deprived the new commander-in-chief, Sir Henry Clinton, of a significant number of his most effective regiments. In response, Clinton, a skilled administrator, attempted to recoup his losses by recruiting loyalists and reorganising the pre-existing provincial corps. He was able to do this because, unlike British regiments, provincial units were raised in North America under the authority of the commander-in-chief, not the king. Entire battalions were disbanded or broken up and drafted into receiving regiments, and from this ineffective jumble Clinton formed 2 new loyalist regiments, the Volunteers of Ireland and the British Legion. He later explained that the creation of the British Legion was for the reception of Europeans who might choose to join it. The implication being that the recruits would be first-generation Americans of British or Irish stock, whose loyalties Clinton presumed would be more robust. Few regiments have ever been established under a bigger misnomer than the British Legion, for contrary to Clinton's expectations, only a handful of the most senior recruits were British-born. Instead, its rank and file were predominantly Americans. Muster records of Captain Benjamin Ogden's troop reveal that of the 47 soldiers for whom a birthplace was recorded, 31 came from Westchester County, New York, 4 came from other parts of New York or Connecticut, with just 4 from New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and only 7 were born in England. The average age of these men at the time of drafting was 25, although 2 recruits were over 50. This muster snapshot also belies the common misconception that loyalists were wealthy or large landowners. Although the senior American officers of loyalist regiments often fell into this category, most of Ogden's rank and file were employed in those commonplace occupations that dominated colonial America. It listed 19 as husbandmen, a medieval term for a tenant farmer whose social status fell below that of the yeoman, of whom there were 5 in the troop. These were by far the most numerous occupations. In addition, there were 5 shoemakers, 3 carpenters, serving alongside a scattering of individuals described as coopers, millers and weavers. None of the rank and file were employed in professional occupations. Irish Catholics were also a sizable manpower pool in colonial America, and at a time when Catholics could not join the British Army, they offered Clinton the option of arming them as loyalists instead. Most of these Catholics were transferred into Lord Rawdon's Volunteers of Ireland, or Cathcart's British Legion. Finally, and perhaps most surprisingly, between 400 and 500 of the men amalgamated into the two new regiments were rebel deserters. The British Legion's formation embodied the best and worst of the High Command. The principles behind its establishment were imaginative and forward-looking. The creation of a loyalist unit which the British had enough confidence in to operate independently of the regular army was a significant step forward. Yet it was cobbled together with ardent loyalists and rebel deserters alike, and the men shared little geographical or cultural familiarity. The Legion's original leader was not Tarleton, but William Shaw, Lord Cathcart, a 22-year-old aristocrat and aide to the Commander-in-Chief. On August 31st, 1778, Tarleton, along with Colonel John Graves Simcoe of the Queen's Rangers, led the British Legion on their first major mission. They rode out of Kingsbridge in the early morning towards Cortland's Ridge on the Westchester County border, intent on ambushing a force of Stockbridge Mohican Indians who were harassing Loyalist farmers in the Hudson Islands. Although the Indians were ambushed and destroyed as an effective fighting force, Tarleton almost died when he overbalanced and fell at the feet of a Mohican warrior. The Indian made to kill him but lost his bayonet and was himself dispatched by a legionnaire. The battle was a triumph for the Legion, highlighting Tarleton's personal bravery and the effectiveness of his new force. Simcoe noted that, in Lieutenant Colonel Tarleton, he had a colleague full of enterprise and spirit, and anxious for every opportunity to distinguish himself. The following summer, Colonel Eliza Sheldon's veteran 2nd Dragoons were destroyed at Pound Ridge in July 1779, with Tarleton capturing the regiment's flag and scattering troops commanded by Benjamin Talmadge. The affair was a humiliating defeat for the Americans, and he wrote, "Their disgrace in the loss of the standard of the regiment was great." Tarleton may have exaggerated the significance of the loss at the time, but it was the first American flag with 13 red and white stripes. He smuggled the prototype Stars and Stripes home to Breakspears, where it would hang in a glass vitrine for 2 centuries before returning to the United States in 2006. In need of good news, Clinton sent Tarleton's victory to the War Office in London as a signal of his more aggressive campaigning, and after the London Gazetteer published a story, the British Legion and its commander came to the public's attention. An impasse in the north led the British to invade the south, a strategy that began with the capture of Charleston, South Carolina, along with nearly all the rebel forces in the region. A key factor in capturing Charleston was Tarleton's success in cutting off supplies and reinforcements and destroying rebel militias on its periphery. His victories at Monk's Corner and Leonard's Ferry sealed all escape routes from Charleston, helping to force its surrender. All that was left of the organised American force was a small group of Virginian reinforcements commanded by Colonel Abraham Buford. The British saw Buford's contingent as a threat, even as it was retreating towards Hillsborough, North Carolina, and on May the 27th, Tarleton was sent in pursuit. Using a tactic that would become his trademark, he forced his men to cover 105 miles in 54 hours. At Camden, Tarleton arrived late and set off for the final chase around midnight. By the next afternoon, his vanguard had reached Buford's resting place. The fighting lasted only a few minutes before many of the Americans began to lay down their arms and beg for quarter. Only this part of the action remains undisputed, while the events that followed have been the subject of intense controversy ever since. The cold statistics were shocking enough. Tarleton's official battle report listed American casualties as 113 men killed, with 147 wounded and released on parole. Those killed represented a third of Buford's entire force. It was a shockingly disproportionate ratio of fatalities to the number involved. Waxhaw's was one of the most one-sided engagements of the war, but was it a massacre? This interpretation rests on Buford's official report and two first-hand accounts, although neither was written close to the actual battle. The only American participant in the struggle who made a contemporary accusation was Buford. Of those who survived, not one American claimed a massacre occurred. The pension applications of over 50 Americans who served in the battle do not contain a single allegation of improper behaviour by the British Legion. As Tarleton himself declared, the Americans suffered a high loss of officers and men as a result of the dragoons breaking the infantry so effectively, though he admitted the Legion continued to attack Patriot troops even after most had surrendered. However, that this butchery occurred in front of his eyes, or as some suggest with his consent, is evidently false. Tarleton's horse was shot from under him during the initial charge, either pinning him to the ground or leaving him incapacitated. If any single incident served as the catalyst for the confusion and slaughter which followed, then this was it. Nevertheless, remember Tarleton's quarter became a rallying cry that led hundreds into the militia ranks, and no man who joined the rebel colours bothered to ask whether the massacre story was founded on fact or not. Legion troops continued to distinguish themselves in the south, particularly during the battles of Fishing Creek and Camden. Here Cornwallis had such faith in Tarleton that he gave him discretionary orders to seize any opportunity that might offer to break the American lines. This Tarleton did, and as the Continental Army gave way, the Legion pursued the fleeing Continentals to Hanging Rock, a 22-mile chase. British Commissary Charles Stedman offered a graphic description of the carnage the Legion inflicted on the Continentals. The number of dead horses, broken wagons, and baggage scattered on the road, he wrote, formed a scene of perfect horror and confusion. Arms, knapsacks, and accoutrements found were innumerable. Such was the terror and dismay of the Americans. In his official dispatch, Cornwallis wrote laudatory letters to England stating, "I think it is my duty to declare that Tarleton is one of the most promising officers I ever knew. I have no private connection with him, nor any motivation for recommending him, other than the desire of seeing extraordinary merit rewarded." Even though the victory was magnificent and Tarleton was lauded effusively, there would be dire consequences for the British Legion. Continental prisoners opted to serve with the British rather than face the uncertainty of a forced march to Charleston as prisoners of war. Many ended up in Tarleton's corps with disastrous results. Deserters now replaced men who had joined out of loyalty. They lacked a similar motivation, a situation that was to be profound at the Battle of Cowpens. The British victories at Charleston and Camden were magnificent but ultimately empty victories. Thanks to the guerrilla tactics of Thomas Sumter and Francis Marion, large swathes of South Carolina remained outside British jurisdiction. Nathaniel Greene had also succeeded General Gates and immediately split his army into two, forcing Cornwallis to dispatch Tarleton with the flower of the British army to hunt down Morgan's part. Tarleton proposed a strategy to Cornwallis. "When I advanced, I must either destroy Morgan's corps or push it before me over the broad river towards King's Mountain. In doing so," Tarleton suggested, "Cornwallis could move north with the main army, positioning Morgan between the two British wings. Morgan would be pinned between two encroaching armies." It was a sound strategy, but unfortunately for the British this did not happen. Although Tarleton informed Cornwallis of his intended movements and requested the main British army to move in concert, Cornwallis failed to cooperate. Instead, he waited for reinforcements to arrive from Charleston. Crucially, he failed to inform Tarleton of his change in plan. As a result, Tarleton would commit himself to the disastrous Battle of Cowpens, a battle he may never have fought if his original plan of concerted action had been implemented. On January the 17th, flooded creeks and treacherous ravines hindered the progress of the British troops, who had run out of food the day before. But Tarleton drove his men on through the cold black night, fearing Morgan would slip away. A trot of 4 hours before coming into action is not ideal preparation for man or beast, but when Tarleton caught sight of Morgan's army, his gamble appeared to have paid off. As Tarleton later observed, it appeared that Morgan had placed his forces on a battlefield tailor-made for their destruction. Instead, what he actually encountered were slight hills and ridges which conspired to overwhelm his forces, while the flanking river cane not only prevented Morgan's militia from fleeing, but funneled Tarleton's own men. Rather than it being an ideal battlefield, Tarleton was forced to mount a blind frontal assault up a deceptive array of slopes without his usual advantage of surprise or shock. The Americans were less likely to be overrun and outflanked, and once the British were disorganised and sapped, Morgan could launch a devastating counterattack. As Tarleton's men attacked, Morgan instructed the militia to leave the front line after firing 2 rounds. The British mistook the repositioning of the Americans as a rout and ran into an unexpected volley of concentrated rifle fire, coupled with a cavalry charge and the return of the militia. Tarleton escaped, but Morgan's troops decimated his army. More than 800 British men were killed, wounded or captured. The Americans suffered less than 100 casualties in the first Patriot victory, to demonstrate that they could outfight a similar British force without any other factors such as surprise or geography to assist them. Tarleton's culpability for the loss of the Battle of Cowpens has been much discussed, and there's no doubt he made mistakes. Ban's men were exhausted before they arrived on the field, and despite his statement that their initial disposition was unremarkable, he failed to position his troops to their full advantage. Fatally, the 71st Regiment of Highlanders, under the command of Major Arthur MacArthur, formed up to the rear of British regulars instead of behind the weaker Princess of Wales loyalist remnant to the centre-right. Later in dispatches to Cornwallis, Tarleton insisted that his order of battle was not the reason for the defeat, and Cornwallis agreed. But Tarleton did not confer with either of his senior regimental commanders, Majors MacArthur of the Highlanders or Newmarsh of the Fusiliers, and this was a wretched position for his most potent infantry battalion. By placing them on his more muscular flank and moving off before they were ready, Tarleton compromised his offensive power. His handling of the Legion cavalry was also irrational. These were Tarleton's elite shock troops, and it's impossible to see how the outnumbered American cavalry could have repelled the dragoons had he concentrated them. Instead, Tarleton handed Colonel William Washington the opportunity to defeat them in detail by splitting his cavalry into 3 sections. Positioning 50 men under Captain Ogilvie on his left flank, while placing another 50 under Lieutenant Nettles on the right, brought him no tactical advantage. These flank squadrons were too feeble to achieve any breakthrough, even when the opportunity arose. It was an unfathomable error of command. The mistake was compounded by his failure to deploy his cavalry reserve until too late. Major MacArthur, captured alongside most of the 71st Highlanders, told the Americans that they would have been routed if his advice had been followed to charge with all the horse at the moment the rebel militia was retreating. Alexander Chesney, a lieutenant in the South Carolina Loyalist militia, was more critical, stating, "We suffered a total defeat by some dreadful mismanagement. I was with Tarleton in the charge, who behaved bravely but imprudently. Relying on the valour of his troops, impatient of delay and overconfident of success, Tarleton's arrogance doomed his men." A 30-minute battle effectively ended an 8-year war. A captured officer of the 71st, Roderick Mackenzie, concluded, "I will hazard, had Earl Cornwallis not been deprived of his light troops at Cowpens, the blockade at Yorktown would never have taken place." After the war, one of the Continental Army's finest cavalry officers, Light Horse Harry Lee, condensed Tarleton's military abilities down to 2 brief sentences. The father of Confederate General Robert E. Lee declared that the Legion commander was more distinguished for courage and activity than management and address. His mode of operation was to overtake and fight. This criticism of Tarleton's abilities persists, and historical portrayals consistently paint him as little more than a rake-el commander whose capabilities were limited to blind courage and indiscriminate aggression. But though Lee's appraisal captures the essence of Tarleton's service and certainly holds true for Cowpens, it does an injustice to his abilities both as an administrator and a tactician. There is no question Ban found routine staff work tedious, and on several occasions his superior officers upbraided him for failing to provide complete or accurate reports. But a regiment's training, recruitment and supply is ultimately the responsibility of its lieutenant colonel, and throughout the war Tarleton's organisational abilities ensured his men were adequately clothed, fed and mounted, often in the face of overwhelming obstacles. Tarleton was also one of the few senior officers who grasped the nature of battle in America. He fought the rebels in the same aggressive, informal manner that they fought the British, often with stunning results. Lord Cornwallis was to pay him the tribute that no provincial regiment was trained in the same exemplary care or discipline. After the destruction of two British armies at King's Mountain and Cowpens, the army was effectively marching blind in a colony teeming with enemies. Although they achieved victories at Cowman's Ford, Torrance Tavern and Guildford Courthouse, where Tarleton was wounded and had 2 fingers amputated, the British army was ground down, chasing down the Americans and surviving on little more than corn husks and carrion. Nevertheless, ever a leader, Tarleton fought on with one arm in a sling. In a strategic gamble that smacked of desperation, Cornwallis abandoned the Carolinas and invaded Virginia, and on June 1, 1781 reached Hanover, where he intercepted American dispatches, informing him Thomas Jefferson and representatives of the legislature had fled Richmond on the British approach. To arrest such an illustrious patriot would be a political coup for Cornwallis, and he dispatched Tarleton to break up the assembly and apprehend Jefferson. Tarleton would need to ride over 70 miles across a region inhabited almost entirely by rebels, but this was the kind of operation he thrived on. On June the 3rd, he rode out with 180 legionnaires and 70 mounted infantrymen of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers towards Charlottesville. By any standard, Tarleton's raid was a remarkable achievement. Leading just a few hundred men, he burned supplies and captured Virginia assemblymen, including the frontiersman Daniel Boone. He also came within minutes of apprehending Thomas Jefferson, who fled as the Legion rode up Mulberry Row. Despite being a preeminent leader of the rebellion, Monticello was spared, although the ever-thirsty Tarleton liberated much of Jefferson's wine cellar. Tarleton was captured alongside the rest of Cornwallis's army at Yorktown and arrived in England on parole in January 1782. In a nation bereft of war heroes, it was natural that the handsome maimed warrior would attract widespread attention. He was summoned to a court levee at St. James's Palace. There, alongside 2 fellow veterans, Colonels Dundas and Lake, he was granted an audience with the man for whom he'd shed so much blood, King George III. In October 1783, the legion he led disbanded, but the threadbare legionnaires experienced a less glorious return to their homes. Many had been absent from their native states for years while in service to the king. Now they faced permanent exile in the wastelands of Nova Scotia. Back in England, Tarleton continued to live extravagantly despite being on the half pay as a parole colonel, and before long could not keep up with his spendthrift friends, who risked a fortune on a card turn. His family had long grown weary of bailing him out and refused to pay off his exorbitant debts. In search of a situation, Tarleton alighted upon the obvious career of politics and less obvious one of author. Elected as a Whig for his hometown to Parliament in 1790, he did not shy away from exalting his wartime military service, showing up at the hustings attired in his Legion green ribbon and to hold up his mutilated hand and declare, "General Tarleton is known to you. He never ran away from an enemy sword, nor did he run after a ministerial purse." The slogan was effective enough to get him elected 4 times, but despite being a member until 1812, he made little impression in Parliament. Debates on slavery and the army were the only topics that animated him. He became a vociferous vocal opponent of those who aimed at ending the slave trade in the British Empire, particularly William Wilberforce, whose policies he referred to as a mistaken philanthropy. With Britain being almost constantly at war from 1793 until 1815, a place for the aggressive cavalry officer seemed assured. But though Tarleton was promoted in 1801 to Lieutenant General and 1812 to full General, he never again led troops in battle. He hoped to command British forces in the Peninsular War, but the position was instead given to Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington. The jealous Tarleton finished his military career by stating in Parliament that he could not conscientiously vote that the thanks of the House should be given to Wellesley for his victory at the Battle of Talavera. It was a churlish attitude for the old hero of Britain's army to exhibit toward the new one. Marion and Morgan may have injured him, but it was his fellow Englishman, the Duke of Wellington, who finally finished him. After a life filled with women and gaming, in middle age he abandoned both. Instead, he settled down to his own peculiar form of contented tranquility by marrying Susan Bertie, the natural daughter of the 4th Duke of Ancaster. She was, not coincidentally, 24 years his junior and extremely wealthy. They had no children. Tarleton did, however, father an illegitimate daughter in 1797 before his marriage, whom he baptised with the wonderfully egocentric name Banina. Tarleton died in January 1833, having outlived virtually all of his Revolutionary War contemporaries, an enigma but a colourful one for all that. Many tried to sum up this complex man but failed, and it was his erstwhile lover Mary Robinson who perhaps came closest to the truth. In her novel The False Friend, she portrays the thinly disguised hero Treville as being too polite to be religious, too witty to be learned, and too handsome to be discreet. Tarleton was certainly a man of contrasting fortunes and passions, and spent much of his life fantastically rich or heavily in debt. He courted violence but died in his bed, without a struggle or a sigh. As a young man was addicted to women, but as an older one became a devoted and faithful husband. Perhaps recognising these contradictions himself, when granted his baronetcy, he chose as his coat of arms the legend, Post nubila Phoebus, after the clouds come the sun.